Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Bringing Quality Engineering to Product Management with Capital's One Senior Product Manager, Evan Wiley. A quick intro about our speaker. Evan has been working at Capital One for over 6 years. A true testing renaissance man, Evan started as a quality engineer and recently transitioned to a senior product manager. His professional experience and skills encompass numerous programming languages, multitude of tools, techniques, and testing approaches. And you are more than welcome to check out his LinkedIn profile to see how versatile and skillful he is. So I think it's best to let him speak now. Evan, the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Addie. I appreciate everyone's time today and for Addie's time for having me. I would like to introduce to you a topic that I'd like to talk about more, and I think that will be an interesting topic to discuss afterwards in the Q&A as well. It's introducing quality engineering to product management. So just a quick introduction about myself. As Addie spoke earlier, I've been a quality engineer for 6 years at Capital One. I started in product management around 6 months ago, so relatively still new to it and still adopting some practices. And then we're also walking some things about myself. I like walking my dog Gatsby, the Golden, and listening to podcasts. So it's a quick fun fact. The agenda, so we're overview of quality engineering, and then I'm going to go over a possible proposal that you can implement within your own teams is cross-training product management and quality engineering, and then also the vice versa, cross-training quality engineering with product management. So why did I choose this topic? So there's an engineering culture about it. So coming from my background in quality engineering, I really felt like it was important to talk about a topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts, of course, is testing. And kind of my journey behind that was I started, well, in my 5th year at Capital One, I started in commercial card tech as a quality engineer. And I began to listen to some empathy interviews we were having with clients. And it really sparked an idea in me that, well, why don't we involve, since we're involving the whole team in this process, it's a great way to get those inputs from all of your team members into that overall product management process. And that's kind of also what sparked me to join into transitioning to product management. So what is quality engineering? So just a background on this, this whole workflow that you see here, there's a lot of different types of testing out there. This is what I've come up with. There's obviously going to be more things that you might throw in there that could also be part of quality engineering. But I've essentially just summed it up as a discipline of finding the bugs within functional products early and often. So what can encompass quality engineering? There's the manual side of things. So there's the manual testing, going through your applications in different environments, your automation testing. So this is actually creating test automation scripts that you can run that would allow you to walk through your application's flow, press a start button or however you run your automation scripts and be able to validate whether things are passing or failing. You also have your production testing. So with this, you could have manual production tests running. So these are things that possibly you have, for example, a login for your production application. You log in into a test account, verify that things are working before you push that code to production. And then there's the test case design aspect to it. So you're developing all these scenarios, you're coming up with the test cases, the scenario outlines, and so forth. You have your test execution, which is the actual implementation of your tests and what you've designed into QA environments, testing environments, and eventually your production environments. Then you have your penetration testing. So with this, you could have a multitude of different areas for that. SQL injection, things that you're doing within your application to test that it's secure from attacks. This can either be inside of your company or outside of your company. And then finally, your accessibility testing. So this is something that is very familiar to some folks and very familiar not to other folks. So accessibility testing is essentially you have an application and you want to have your voiceover on turned on that application and validate that you are able to navigate that application. I always use the analogy of, can you navigate your application while blindfolded? Because some of your users might have a visual disability, or if you have any sort of accessibility issues, you want to make sure that your end users are able to accomplish what they set out to do on your application. And finally, this work always changes across organizations. So what I'm saying here might not be applicable to your organization, but it's just a catch-all. And you can feel free to add or to subtract from that. It's all based upon what your functionality or your job role might entail. So what is product management? There's a lot of things to product management, and I also think this varies from organization to organization. So what I'm saying here, like I said earlier, might not apply to where you to what your organization could possibly do. But there's also some points I wanted to add to here, and there's empathy interviews with customers. So what you want to do is you're essentially trying to be the voice of the customer, which ties into my second point. So with each of these empathy interviews you do, you want to ensure that you get the theme of that conversation upon each of those interviews that you do when you're testing out your product in the market. And maybe if you don't have your product in the market, you can also do empathy interviews to figure out what are the pain points of your application, how would you market certain functionalities to users, and this is all part of product management, is figuring out what are those pain points and then putting those within a roadmap that you can solve later down the road, whether it be in 3 months, 6 months, and in all those time frames, you want to make sure that you're releasing often, or as much as your team or development team is comfortable with, so that you can measure the results of what you're releasing. So quality over quantity. This ties back to what I was talking about earlier, is with the release schedules. So users want products that do what they want. So with quality engineering, we focus on is the functionality correct? And when you use the application, you become more accustomed to if you are embodying or putting yourself in the shoes of your end customer, you're figuring out by testing that application what is there something that could possibly be down the road that the customer may or may not like. And sometimes what you're building applies to, you might be the customer of that application as well. For example, if there's a quality engineer who's testing Facebook or something like that, and they're a quality engineer at Facebook, they might have a set of test cases, but they also might be an end user of it. So they're testing out something that is in their own domain and their own knowledge base. And that also ties into, okay, well, if there is a bug here, say if they are testing like the Facebook home dashboard page and they want to log out of their application, they could say, hey, like maybe I can optimize that experience to have just a one-click log out or something like that. Just a simple example to show, and that brings the product fold into where quality engineers are. And I believe that that gives a higher level fidelity of quality behind it, because when you combine those certain disciplines, or you have that kind of cross functionality or cross conversation between those two different disciplines, I believe that brings an exceptional experience to end users. And also it gives both sides the new skill sets that provides an overall enhanced experience. So, and it's a constant evolution. So when you think about organizations, or for example, I'll talk about this in the next slide, but when you think about your company's culture, that all ties into the whole quality over quantity. You want to make sure that you have like a transparent building process and a transparent process of how you want to diversify the skill sets of your engineers in your organization. So this is what I was saying earlier. So when we're cross-training product managers with quality engineers, we're bringing both disciplines together, and I believe that overall raises the bar for our end customers. And this is not saying that you need to do this. It's something that I believe can enhance organizational cultures, and it bridges the gaps to give more insights to end users, because maybe your quality engineers have been very hands-on with a certain functionality of a certain page, and maybe they can bring insights to those conversations that they have with product managers. And in a demo later on, I'll show you how there could be a possible examples or ways that you can go about doing that. And overall, like, I believe that from my own experience, that blending these two will help in the future. A good example I like to give of that is sometimes when I was in my in commercial card, we had a user interface that would show a dashboard of our clients, and or a dashboard of showing like account summaries, balances for certain client customers. And I would be able to test all of these different functionalities and scenarios for our clients, for that certain application in different browsers, and be able to show that to our product managers and say, hey, I found a bug in IE 11, and show them the different cross-browser testing features. And that also elevates the roadmap in the future to say, hey, let's make sure we have a good cross-browsing experience across all the different browsers that we have. So that's just an example of ways that I've been able to be a part of that whole development experience, and show that I definitely feel like there are ways that this this gap can be crossed over, and I think it just overall gives more insights. So introducing quality engineers to product management. So as I was saying earlier, when I was in commercial card, we'd invite quality engineers to empathy interviews. And I'm saying it depends on your organization and what sort of empathy interviews you're doing. I honestly, as long as it's good within your culture, and if you influence the culture, it'll help drive those future conversations down the road to say, okay, we've had these empathy interviews with this clients. These are the pain points we saw. And when you involve that whole team, not just the quality engineers, to be a part of those empathy interviews, maybe a developer might come to you and say, hey, I saw from this empathy interview, maybe this one point that one of our customers brought up, we could probably implement into a future roadmap. And then you have those conversations, and it gets the whole team synergized and really excited about your product as well. So here I'll give a demo, a walkthrough of Gherkin scenarios. It's a given when then scenario. And then I also have like a walkthrough of visual validations that I can show you that. And these are more examples of how you could use visual validations. And I'll also give those visual validations as anecdotes when talking to product managers and drive from my own experiences from that. So when we're showing this Gherkin example, it's essentially the intersection between the two roles. At first, it comes to when you're grooming with the teams and you're actually putting that functionality down onto the page for road mapping. A good example of this is the Google search homepage. So like if we're doing a scenario for validating the look and feel of the Google search page, we have a typical given when then. So just to give some context about what a given when then is, there's multiple different I'd say methodologies or terms for this. You could call it behavioral driven development, automated testing driven development, but they essentially come down and boil down to the same thing, which is having these Gherkin scenarios that you're able to give a background on, give the action on, and then give the resulting action. So I'm going to go through this example, and it'll make more sense when we go through it. So given I'm on the Google homepage, and this is for validating the look and feel of the Google search page, given I'm on the Google homepage, you're giving the background of what you're doing or where you're at. When I enter a search for product management, so this is your action, so what you're doing on the page, then I'll see the look and feel for the Google results page. So this is essentially saying, okay, say for example, you were a developer at Google or you're a quality engineer at Google. If they have like probably in their beginnings, they had like a wireframe of their page, and you're sitting with your product manager, and when they are developing this scenario, they would probably, maybe if it's in its infancy, this is when it started, but for example, let's just say in hindsight, maybe as an example, if they were to create validations for this scenario, they would say, okay, given I'm on the Google homepage, or given, you can also add in there that your user, given I am the Google user, when I enter a search for product management, that's the action, and then I'll see the look and feel of the Google results page. That's the desired outcome. So when we go through this, you can introduce your product managers to this sort of scenario outline. And when you're actually going through and cross-training them with a quality engineering discipline, you can say, okay, I have this scenario outline. Here's how it works within my automation framework. So you can go through and show them that. And that can gauge the interest level too. If say if you're a product manager and you have your quality engineer show you this, that might show them like, hey, this looks interesting. Let me just try to execute that for me. I want to see how it's working. And that's part of that user acceptance testing. So it gets both of them involved with that whole process. And that's just a quick way you can start implementing that within your team. And then also it gauges their interest level to see if, oh, hey, let's try to explore that a little bit deeper and do a little bit more digging on that. So here I decided to go with Apple tools for visual validation, and it's a use of a manual testing skill set. So not only are you seeing the screenshots for this, apologies for the title there. This is something that I wanted to fix, but it's basically we're going to go through Apple tools for visual validation. And go through a baseline and compare against the current set of screenshots and see what the differences are. So here I'm going to transition to one of my screenshots so I can give you an example of how you can also facilitate this conversation. Okay, so here you can see that we have Apple Tools eyes. So this is a generic example. So say if you were going through and for that that scenario that I gave earlier, and you configured this maybe for the Google developers page, and you're showing them, okay, hey, I did this test automation. Now it's running, it's completed, and these are the results. So when you're in your user acceptance testing, you can show them, okay, hey, here's my baseline, and you can explain the whole concept around a baseline and checkpoint. So basically, when we're going through that whole Gherkin scenario, you can then introduce in following conversations these advanced testing tools. So with Apple tools, it's definitely a huge benefit that we've seen with our own organizations at Capital One. And I think just when we were developing Gherkin scenarios and modifying them to include Apple tools, we saw a huge benefit with it. Like there's been a few examples that I could think of when I showed basically like a screenshot of a mobile device in Apple tools, and there was a breaking point between like we had acceptance criteria for that it should break at this point and display in this viewpoint, and it didn't meet that criteria, and I would show it to our product manager and said, hey, these are the differences. So but when we go back to this example, you can have your conversations filtered around, okay, well, we have our baseline here, the Google Test Automation Conference, and then on the right, you also have your checkpoints. So with each of these, it's going to show the differences up here, unresolved. And then when you toggle to each of those issues and you see the right arrow there and the left arrow, you can click on that and go to each of those differences with the product manager. And that'll also show them the huge value that you're bringing to the table in quality engineering, is that you're pointing out all these issues and able to, and then if they're interested even more, you can cross-train them on how they can view these actual implementations. You can go into your team view, you can add them to your team and have them go through all of these screenshots, the results of the tests and so forth. I think I have a few more slides here. I can show you that. So here's another one. This is for the results breakdown. So say if you have different tests, say if you have login process, you have test results for each of those. You have differences, you have the browsers you were testing on, you have the viewports that you were using, the OS, what it's failing for, what it's passing for, your baseline, how many times is it passing your baseline, and total amount of tests. So this is a good overview you could show your product manager, and also gauges their interests along the way. You can see here that there was past tests as well, so they can say, okay, it failed at the latest test that we had for this story, and you'll be able to show them those bugs along the way, and then this will also give them hands-on with the dashboard that they can start messing around with, and also it cross-trains them on that whole quality engineering process, at least the results part when you first start. Let's see, and then we also have, and this is when you can dig into the actual view of the results. So you can see here that our baseline, it only has these two parts highlighted, so closed in this bar. You can see that the text differences are different. So you can go down in scope. So you could say like, all right, I only want to check the layout of this. So this view might change to just show the layout. Or you want to do text and it would show you like this text is different than this one, like the close and open would be different. And then you could also see that difference when you say there's no text here and you could see a closed here. So that's also some of these processes you can always implement within your team. And I believe that when you keep showing them these kind of results, they're going to see that value more and more. And then ultimately, it'll lead back into your company culture. Let me just go back to that slide here. Yep. So when we have our company culture, we have a tenet within our own organization. We value quality over velocity. So good engineering doesn't happen overnight. Prioritizing delivery over engineering excellence will be highly considered and documented decision. So that's a within our own culture at Capital One, we highly believe in the quality of the code we're delivering, and this is tying back to that whole embodying the mentality that we can all learn from each other, and that I think each discipline, if you cross those boundaries, those disciplines can also learn from each other, and that company culture you can also maybe influence up, and if it's not within your own company culture, you can say, hey, if that, maybe we should make this a tenet within our own organization as well, and when you show them these sort of examples, it'll rally people around that. So let's just recap here, just so I can go back and before we have questions, I'll recap this. So I went over a recap of our quality engineering role. I did a quality versus quantity in delivering value to the enterprise. So we value the quality of the code, and that also ties into your company culture, which you can influence up, and that way you can continually show that value within your own organization of how you're doing that. Cross-training enhances the skills to both disciplines. So what I've shown you earlier in different examples, you can use the Gherkin and Selenium IDE demo. I changed that to our visual demo, so typo on my part, but yeah, please forgive me on that. And then we have our company culture. So that is basically tying back to our tenants and saying, let's value the quality, and let's value looking back and saying, okay, how can each of these disciplines learn from each other and grow in our skill sets together? And then finally, reap the rewards. So the gold medal goes to the customer experience. Our customers are always first at Capital One, and we want to provide that overall enhanced experience to them, and let our teams help us out in also learning about the customer. And as a product manager, we always say, let's be the voice of the customer. So that's essentially what I got. And I'll open it up for questions now, Addie.
Perfect. So we do have some questions. There was a question about the first slide that you talked about, what is quality engineering, and why does quality engineering does not include the developers, only the testers? Was that intentional?
It was not intentional. If I said that, I did not mean it to just include just only quality engineers. I think I've been speaking from my own experience. I know that there's other organizations who do it differently. So I think also anyone could be a quality engineer. I wouldn't say anyone could be a quality engineer, but we all have value sets or skill sets we can bring to the table with testing. And I think we're all overall, like, whether we know it or not, we're all testing something, whether it's our car to turn it on to go somewhere, and we're all testers of the things we use. So I think that not just quality engineers, but developers, there's also that testing aspect to that. There's the SDET role. So if I spoke that just from the quality engineering perspective, it's not just that. We're all testers in some, whether it's within our own job family. I certainly encourage all developers to be testing as well. And also, if you're in an SDET role, that's perfect as well, because then you're developing and testing. And yeah, so I would say it's all dependent upon what framework you're looking at it from. So
regarding the regarding the Gherkin scenario, is it applicable in all use cases, or is it limited to a few specific ones?
That's a good question. Yeah. So with Gherkin scenarios, I typically find it that it's when it's a behavior. So it's anything that's an interaction that you're having in that application. I would say like an example of when you wouldn't use behavior-driven development is possibly you have a tech debt story or something that's more generic and that's not tied down to like an epic or feature. Like with a tech debt story, you would just put in, okay, we have X number of unit tests that need to be updated, and we need to do that by this end of the sprint. So yeah, so I'd say like there's a lot of use cases for it in terms of the features you're delivering and the actual descriptions of those features. So an example of that is definitely like for web applications or for anything that user interacts with, you'll definitely have those behavior-driven development scenarios. And there will also be scenarios where you don't have that. So I hope that answers the question for that. I was trying to be as specific as possible with that.
So we have someone asking for specific examples, if you can give them, for the advantages of the customer gaining knowledge on quality engineering and vice versa, quality engineering gaining knowledge both on product management and customer needs. If you have specific examples from your experience.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a very good touch point there, because there are use cases where we'll have production defects, right? So some of that, depending on like this, all depends upon your company, your organization. But I know that there have been a few use cases where you could have a customer who has a defect within that application. And maybe that comes up during an empathy interview or something like that. Say you note it down, you have the customer show you those issues, and maybe you invite the quality engineer into that to say, hey, this is the scenario they came up with. Let's go back to the development team and add this as something that we're going to fix as a defect in our next sprint or something of that nature. So I think that's where you'll get the interaction between the quality engineering and the customer. And also like that ties back in their culture, right? If sometimes you might have like that empathy interview and then that customer or usability experience, and that customer might find a defect in that experience, which is okay. That's part of agile, right? We're not going to always deliver everything perfectly the first time. So that would be something you would say, okay, well, let's go back to like the engineering team, work on that, and then re-deliver it as a better experience. So I would say that whole interaction, when you find those issues, you can tie back in the customer to the quality engineer, and possibly that the quality engineer can teach the customer about like that they could be like, oh, you're doing the manual testing part for me. So so yeah, so that is I could see that as an example from in my own mind about a way that those interactions can be very helpful, and overall you just like learn from each other in that whole experience, because we always say in product management we can try to be the voice of the customer. You always have to talk to the customer first, because you're always not going to always, and also you're never going to find all the defects the first time. So I think that's a good example.
Regarding the quality over quantity slide, how do you explain that to management? This sounds like something that management needs to support and push. Can you even do that bottom up?
Yeah, I think that depends on the organization. I think a lot of times you can possibly that whole experience could be an example of something that you could display as metrics or put some data behind it. You could say possibly we do these wave cycles of delivering, say like you want to deliver a new login experience to customers, and that whole quality over quantity, there might be a hard deadline for like getting that new login experience in. But a good way to influence on that is say, hey, like login is one of the most important things in this web application. Let's take our time with that. I'll show you that you can show over time as well, even if you have some pushback to say like, hey, we've had, that's where your S2s and S3s come in to say, hey, like we were raising these impediments because we have possibly this authentication defect with our backend. We need more time to fix this, or else it might impact X amount of customers. But also another way to circumvent that is say, hey, we could have a beta experience where they flip to that new login experience, or they flip back to the old experience. So there could be ways to influence in both ways, just putting the product hat on, or you're putting the quality engineering hat on, to say, hey, this is something that we can overall constantly be a part of enhancing our experience. And obviously it's not going to always work perfectly in every scenario, but you can definitely just show the data of those defects or those high severity defects, and show those in those S2 and S3 meeting conversations. And that'll also align upper management to say, hey, that these are actual issues. Let's take our time with this.
You mentioned visual testing. How does that help quality engineering and product management? In your experience in Capital One, what are the benefits that quality engineers and product managers got from utilizing visual testing?
Yeah, so I know coming from my own experience that a lot of the visual testing has been beneficial to see the different dimension sizes that you're working with. So cross-browser testing, I'd say I was able to show a lot of different things that could have rendered differently on different browsers for certain features in Apple tools that I wasn't able to check by myself. I harken back to that example because it comes to mind a lot, is just the going back to, I was developing a new login page or we were developing a new login page for Intellix. And at first that's a commercial product at Capital One. And we had a new login page, and we had to validate that across a bunch of different browsers. So we set up browser types within our automation scripts to consistently run a regression. And then I was checking the reports when I was manually triggering the test automation. And I saw, hey, this is like a different one in this browser. Let me go talk to my product manager about it. And he was able to say like, hey, yeah, that's an issue. Let's put that as a defect, put it as medium to high priority. So yeah, so that's just one example of how you can utilize it. And it's grown significantly since I've used it. And the user base, definitely a lot of people utilize it within Capital One, and we really value the tool as well. So, and we've seen a lot of things from it, and I'm sure that we've just talking with other people at Capital One, they've really enjoyed using it a lot, and see really the benefits of getting all those different visual differences, and also checking about the different viewports that we're using, and the cross-browser testing as well.
What are the metrics that are employed to validate the effectiveness of including quality engineering with product management?
Yeah, that's a new one. So with this whole concept, I feel like I'm almost a pioneer of this because I honestly haven't seen this adopted yet, but I think that with time, that's also part of reason why I wanted to go into product management is to evangelize that customer experience and value and that quality that we're giving to the customer. So I would say that this is like something that honestly that I believe is a concept that can be carried on and and see if it works. It's not going to work in all use cases in all scenarios. I know that this is probably I would think best suited for applications that have a front end and back end, so you can have something you can actively start testing, putting your hands on. And that's not to say it doesn't work for other products, but certainly from my own background, that's been helpful as well.
So any specific suggestions you can share with us to help product managers that haven't worked with QA before on how to include QA in this transition?
Yeah. So I would say that when you're in initially, a good way to interact with that whole team is in those grooming sessions. And also depends on the how your team does them. I know that sometimes it's just the product owners with the developers, but if you're also like a product owner that's also acting as a product manager, you can get those team members involved with that grooming session and then just say, hey, I saw this webinar recently about like let's about grooming like the given when thens together. Let's do that. Let's and maybe if you're a person listening to this and you're a product manager and you just got introduced to behavior driven development, say, hey, let's start implementing that. And that's a good way for to work with that team and say like, hey, here's our use cases. Let's map out like those scenarios, those features, and that's way you get that initial cross training, that cross collaboration. I believe that could foster a whole new paradigm, and that way that they say, oh yeah, we just started behavior driven development. Here's our automation suite, and we can go through and like now that we've groomed them and we've done the development and we're doing the testing now. I can show you how that's working. So you get that like instant, immediate, like clicking feedback of on just that interaction. So I'd say that's definitely a way I would suggest like getting started. I'm actually, since I've only been in this role for about 6 months, I think starting to do that with teams will drastically help as well. That's why I also put together this deck, is to kind of remind myself that I want to start introducing that in the future. So.
And now the reversed question. So do you have any tips for quality engineers and testers and QA people on how to work with product managers that have very different skill sets, sometimes very different work experience from them? How do you or how do you bridge that gap of experience, language, and overall view of the product and work processes?
Yeah, I would first like even the same way that product managers sympathize with your end customers, we all have to empathize with each other. So I think be it first the vulnerable to knowing that we all come from different backgrounds and skill sets, and understand that that's like something that we all have to recognize and work towards collaboration with each other on. So I'd say probably the best way to bridge that gap is if there's any communication barriers or language barriers, I'd say try to put yourself in their shoes and think about what their role is like, or what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And then when you're in your next interaction, you could say, hey, like I saw you doing this. How does this work into this? And it also motivates the other people to continue to invigorate that conversation. They say, hey, this person really took notice of like what I'm doing. So it kind of it reaps rewards on itself. I think it's and also it's a practice what you preach. So I think like part of that is that as humans we're all working on that, and I think that part of that is to just first empathize, and then the second part is to try to put yourself in their shoes and at least try to get a concept or overall concept of what they do to bridge that gap.
You mentioned empathy interviews with the customers a lot of times. So what do those actually include, and how are they run differently when quality engineering is involved versus when only product managers handle them?
Yeah, so from what I've seen so far, it's just been participation by people in those empathy interviews. There isn't, I would say, probably a new paradigm to that would be a suggestion I would say at least that I had was the usability testing aspect. So when you invite like the product managers with the quality engineers into that usability testing, like the quality engineers will be able to see how it works, see how the user is interacting with that, and then keep that in mind when they're going through like the test automation scenarios or the test scenarios, and they say, hey, like I remember him doing this, and this, like maybe we should test this more as well. So that like that hardening phase when you're like almost about ready to ship the product, you can you'll have that thought about like, oh, they actually used it this way. Let's test it that way. So, but from my own experience, that hasn't happened yet. So that's like something that I wanted to like try to champion, at least where I work at, is to say like, hey, let's get that sort of involvement. And so yeah, so I would say like at least start with the interaction of inviting them to those empathy interviews. I'd say the usability test, what I was describing earlier, is how they're using it, which is different from the empathy interview. The empathy interview would just cover asking them questions about how they use the product, and then figuring out what those pain points are or the theme of that whole conversation. Maybe that theme was like you had them go through the new login experience you've shipped, and then you say, oh, like that, I see a pain point in this button. I don't like the color of this button. And that maybe that theme of that conversation is the login button experience. So that could be definitely. I think those. I hope that answers that question, if that makes sense.
And now we have a personal question. How did you deal with the transition from quality engineering to product management? Which role is more challenging, or which role do you enjoy more or most?
Oh yeah. So this is a very personal question. I would say, at least from my own experience, everyone's different, and everyone has different strengths and opportunities to work on. I would say with me, most of my experience has been that at first you have that initial, start into a role. You learn what works and what doesn't while you're doing it. Because I'm a very active learner, so I have to be at least in the role for 6 months to learn what I can improve upon, and what I'm actively like working on, or that I'm doing well at. So I would say like that was I think the whole challenge for me was what I continue to work on is the communication aspect of that, is saying, okay, this is what I understand about our product so far. Does that make sense to you? So I think like just the whole, they're two completely different skill sets, but at the same time they're very similar in that they both focus on the product very heavily. And I think that has helped me, is that I'm very like customer focused, driven. So I think that's definitely helped me with the empathy interviews part, and figuring out what those pain points are. And then the other part of that is the technical aspect is does help to some degree. But I'd say like a lot of product management is very focused on like the on strategy. And then the other part of that is that short-term focus that the quality engineering gives, which is, you know, obviously there's both things to work on both sides. And I think that different things have helped me along the way, like doing Toastmasters and getting outside that comfort zone to be able to have those conversations has helped a lot. And I think it's also, you have to be vulnerable to any of those experiences, because we all have a way of saying that we fail fast, and that if we encounter any obstacles, that we're not going to like let it deter us from doing our job or doing it well. And we're just going to like learn from those experiences and learn and analyze those and synthesize those to say, okay, what do I do as a solution to this then in the future? So so I'd say, yeah, that they're similar in the product sense, but I'd say like the product management's very focused on communication, data driven, and strategy focused.
So that was our last question. I want to thank everyone that joined us for this live session, and of course, thank our speaker, Evan Wiley from Capital One. One quick reminder, because before Evan says his goodbyes, the link to the recording of the session will be emailed to you by end of day Monday, and I hope to see you all at our next event.
Awesome. Thank you, Addie, for having me.